Now, up until now, we focused on equilibrium within a single labor market, where supply and demand meet at a specific wage. But in reality, the economy is made up of many interconnected labor markets. So you could think of the market for tech workers or retail employees, markets for healthcare workers, tons of different industries. Now, these labor markets don't exist in isolation. Changes in one can impact the other. For instance, if wages rise in one industry, workers might leave their jobs in other industries to take the now more higher paying jobs. That will cause a shift in the labor supply in both markets. This means that while each labor market might have its own equilibrium across multiple markets requires balancing how workers and firms interact across the economy as a whole. So next, what we're going to do is explore what happens when we look at equilibrium across multiple labor markets and how they influence each other. Now, in an ideal world, if workers can move freely between jobs and there were no barriers to entry or exit in the labor market, all workers would earn the same wage. That's because workers would naturally gravitate towards higher paying job, and firms would compete for labor by raising their wages. Eventually, this movement would equalize wages across the economy. The idea here is that when wages equal the value of the marginal product of labor across firms, it results in an efficient allocation of workers in the economy. We call this allocative efficiency because the resources, in this case labor, are being used where they create the most value. So for an example, think of an economy where some firms are very productive while other firms are a lot less productive, a lot less efficient. If workers move to the more productive firms where their labor creates more value, the entire economy ends up benefiting. This allocation maximizes the national income since every worker is employed in the role that contributes the most to overall productivity. The invisible hand refers to the way in which individuals acting in their own self-interest lead to outcomes that benefit society as a whole, without that being anyone's intention. Workers seek higher wages and firms seek higher profits, but these individual actions end up leading to allocative efficiency. No one is deliberately trying to maximize the national income, but through this process of free movement and competition, it ends up happening naturally. So for example, a construction worker moving from a low-paying job to a higher-paying one does not only improve their own situation. By doing that, they also help allocate labor where it's now most productive. The firm hiring the worker is better off because they get more value from the labor, and the worker earns a higher wage. This contributes to overall economic efficiency. We say that in equilibrium, the market will have a single wage for workers. This has important implications. In a competitive labor market, wages equal the value of the marginal product of labor. That means that if there are differences in wages between regions for the same type of job or industry, and workers and firms can move between those regions, the invisible hand will eliminate regional wage differences over time. So workers in low-wage regions will receive higher wages over time because that's the marginal value of their production. So eventually, workers in the same field with the same skill level and productivity will have the same wages, even if they start out earning different wages. So let's see an example of this. As a kid, I remember hearing a lot about NAFTA, but I was so young, I didn't really know what it was at the time. But what it did was help break down barriers for trade and employment between the US, Canada, and Mexico, basically allowing freer trade between all three of the countries. Free trade between countries, opening up these markets, kind of expanding them in closer to one market, reduces the wage differences between regions for industries where production is done and goods are sold in both. So if the US and Mexico become like one market for a particular good, that will increase workers' wages in that industry in Mexico because the marginal value of the worker's product increases with the opening of sales in the US. So let's walk through an example of two labor markets linked, but two labor markets that represent different regions. We'll call them North and South for this example. Sorry about that. We'll call them North or South for this example. Let's say the workers in the two regions are exactly the same. They have the same skill level, the same sort of job responsibilities, all of that. However, the wages are higher in the northern region. So that's what's shown here in the figure on the left, the northern region. And then on the right, here we have the southern region. So the wage in equilibrium, WN here for the wage in the north, is higher than it is down here in the south. WS. We'll draw the supply curves as vertical lines in this case. So supply curve in the north, vertical, supply curve in the south here. Because we assume that the supply is perfectly inelastic, so it's not responsive to changes in wages. It makes it easier for us to show movement between countries if we have a vertical supply curve, but we can draw the general upward sloping curve that we're used to and end up with the same results. It's easier this way. So if there are no barriers to migration and firms are able to relocate easily, then this will not persist in the long run, the difference in wages between the two regions. So workers won't stay in a region where wages are lower if they can easily move to another region offering higher wages for the same job. Because, all else being equal, workers prefer to earn more money for their labor. If a similar job is available elsewhere with better pay, workers have an incentive to move to that region, since it allows them to increase their income without doing more work. This movement continues until wages across the regions start to equalize, because as workers leave the low-wage area, the labor supply curve there shrinks, driving wages up. Conversely, as more workers move into the high-wage area, the increased labor supply there pushes wages down, leading to equilibrium across regions. So here you see this in action. Southern workers move to the northern region, which is two things. First, it increases the supply of workers in the north, shifting the curve from Sn to S prime n. So moving from this curve out to here. That pushes the wage down from point A to point B. This corresponds to a lower equilibrium wage, which is shown in the movement from Wn to W star. So the wage level right here. The increase in employment here is shown in the shaded blue area. But we also see a reduction of workers in the southern region because workers are leaving. So now it's taking the supply curve for the south and shifting it to the left. In this case, the wages that are being paid to the workers in the southern region will slowly rise as there are fewer workers in the region for firms to hire. Now, this is going to continue until we move up to the W star, the same wage we see in the northern labor market. At that point, there's no more incentive for workers to move from the south to the north because it's not going to increase their wages. Now, the same basic thing would happen if firms chose to move between the two regions instead of the workers themselves. They would either bring workers with them or hire new workers after they move. Now, note in real life that wages will likely not be exactly equal between regions. It costs money to move, and people don't like moving. Sometimes there's language barriers, there's different culture. It's just a hassle to move. When we consider the costs of moving, including the non-monetary cost, the wages will be equal between the two regions. So it may actually be a little bit higher in the north at the end of this entire process, but the difference in the wages will be captured by the cost of actually moving from one country to another. Sometimes it can be difficult to measure. So like physicists with dark matter, we say it's the difference from what we expect and what we see.